God says, I'm not dictating this either way. Welcome to this week's edition of 7 in 7, where we will try to cover the 7 readings of this week's Torah portion in just about 7 minutes. This week's Torah portion is called Sh'lach. It's the story of Moses sending spies on behalf of the Jewish people and with God's permission to the land of Israel to check out what kind of country it is, whether it would be hard to conquer it, whether they live in open cities or closed cities, what is the nature of the people there. And he also asks the spies to come back with fruits, samples of fruit from the land of Israel, and he sends the 12 leaders of the tribes to be those spies. It's interesting to note that the language the Torah says, Shlach lecha, God tells Moses, send the spies if you will. And this may be the only time in the Torah where Moses and the Jewish people basically have to decide by themselves. God says, I'm not dictating this either way. And so while this turns out to be it turns out detrimental, in fact, in some sense, it's really the first time the Jewish people were able to stand on their own 2 feet without having to have direct instructions from God. And so while, of course, we know that it didn't turn out well, in some sense, this is a milestone for our becoming a people, and both as individuals and as a community, where we can say that this is what we're going to do because we feel that this is what God would want, even if we haven't specifically received those instructions from God himself. The second reading continues the story of the spies and their mission to tour the land of Israel, which they do in about 40 days. They come back to the people of Israel with a report saying that while the land is that of milk and honey, it would be extremely challenging for the Jewish people to conquer it because the people are mighty and strong. Only Caleb and Joshua were the two single spies who come back with a positive version of the report, and they tell the Jewish people that in fact it is conquerable. The Jewish people accept the report given to them by the 10 spies, the majority of the spies, and they weep the entire night. An interesting Hasidic interpretation of the verse Eretz Ochelet Yoshveha is the spies come back and say that Israel is a land that consumes its inhabitants. The word Yoshveha means inhabitants or settlers, but it also literally means those who sit there. And the Hasidic interpretation of that is that Israel is a land that consumes those who sit. If one wants to live in Israel and be successful, you can't sit. You have to keep working. The third reading continues from where the second reading left off and tells us that God tells Moses that he wants to destroy the Jewish people because they've not been faithful to him and they've not trusted in him. Moses tells him that would be a terrible desecration of God's name if all the countries and nations of the world were to find out that God destroyed his own people. And so Moses suggests that perhaps God should forgive them, and God says, Salachti kidvarecha, I will forgive as your words. However, says God, I will have to punish the people and this generation who partook in the sin. The Talmud points out that God says that they have tested me 10 times. They have challenged me 10 times. The Talmud points out that this was the only time that they would receive a punishment this great. And the reason for that is because the Jewish people had participated in Lashon Hara, in evil speech. They had listened to a negative report without pointing out to the spies that they shouldn't be speaking that way. And so even though they had committed many grievances, this would be the only one that they would be punished in this way for the sin of Lashon Hara. The Talmud then points out even greater that this Lashon Hara, this evil speech, actually only was on a country, was only on land, stones, sticks, nothing really important. But certainly when it comes to saying something evil about somebody, about an individual, certainly we should be even more careful with how we talk. The fourth reading offers some more details into God's idea that anyone who was over the age of 20 years old would wander through the desert for the next 40 years until they eventually pass away. The spies would pass away immediately. Only Joshua and Caleb, who came back with a positive report, would live through that generation and would enter the land of Israel. When Jewish people heard about this, a group of Jews decided that they realized and regretted their mistake, and they decided that they would try to go to Israel by themselves. Moses warns them not to do it, and sadly they faced destruction by the Amalekis and the Canaanites. An interesting idea that's presented in this reading is that God says that the 40 years in the desert correspond to the 40 days that the spies wandered and toward Israel. So it turns out that it's 1 year for every day of sin. And if you think that that's a harsh punishment, you should remember that the Torah teaches us Meruba midatayva mimida poranius, that God rewards greater than he punishes. And so if you spend even 1 day doing a mitzvah, certainly the reward would be more than a year's worth of reward. It can be much more than that. Fifth Aliyah continues where the fourth Aliyah left off and tells us the rules and the halachot and the laws that apply to various sacrifices and the amounts of wine, flour, and oil that are brought as libations. An interesting note is that the Torah points out that these laws apply to both a resident citizen of Israel as well as to a convert. And the scholars point out that the word convert appears 7 times in this week's Torah portion, and that is to allude to the fact that converts are obligated in the 7 mitzvot of Noahide laws before they became converts, whereas Jews are, of course, obligated in 613 mitzvot. But that's not to say that a convert is any less worthy than a Jew who has been keeping all 613 mitzvot their whole life. The sixth Aliyah has 2 fascinating mitzvot, 2 fascinating commandments. The first one is the mitzvah of challah, which is the obligation to take off a portion of dough that you make when you're baking bread. The second mitzvah is when a court erroneously permits something that turns out to be a form of idol worship. The mitzvah is the details and the halachot of how the court has to go about rectifying it. The Sforno comments, and he points out that the mitzvah of challah is related to the story of the spies, because as soon as the Jewish people would get to Israel, they would need to have many more blessings in their life, and those kinds of blessings come through the mitzvah of challah, as the prophet Ezekiel tells us that through giving challah, there are many more blessings will come to your home. The seventh and final reading continues with the same theme about an individual who is guilty, whether on purpose or by mistake, of practicing idol worship. The Torah tells the story of an individual who desecrates Shabbat, and he's taken out and executed. And finally, the Torah tells us the mitzvah of tzitzit, which is to have fringes on a 4-cornered garment. And the Torah tells us that when someone will keep the mitzvah of tzitzit, that'll help them remind themselves about God and all his mitzvot, and to stay away from temptations of the heart and of the eyes. The relationship between the mitzvah of tzitzit and helping us remember all the other mitzvot is the word tzitzit. Tzaddik is 90, and Yud is 10, and Taf is 400. So in total, that would make 600. If you add the 8 strings on each corner plus the 5 knots, you have 613, which is the numeric value of all the mitzvot. And so the mitzvah of tzitzit really encompasses and reminds us about all the mitzvot, and serves as a constant reminder throughout our day of the God who is with us and watching us. Wishing you a wonderful week and a Shabbat Shalom.